So let's start with the webinar. Welcome everybody. I see 29 participants in the webinar, which is really a nice number of people for a discussion. I'll introduce a little bit the seminar series. The Center for Development Impact is a joint community of practice between the Institute of Development Studies, ITED, a consultancy firm, and the University of East Anglia. And it is especially thinking about innovative ways of assessing impact in complex programs. So it's trying to look for ways that you can have meaningful information about the effectiveness of interventions, while at the same time acknowledging that lots of those programs are so complex that you can't do it with simple before, after, or with or without measurements. We organize webinars a bit irregular the last years, but generally every 2 months or so we have a webinar where people present their experiences with the challenges of impact evaluation. And we have practice papers, and one of the practice papers will be presented by Peter Taylor. The practice papers are available on the website. We have, I think, around 25 or so now, where people develop their experiences a little bit more in view of recommendations for other people who are struggling with the same challenges of impact evaluation. Today we have a webinar by Peter Taylor especially about his experiences when he was working in the International Development Research Center, IDRC. Peter Taylor is Director of Research currently at Institute of Development Studies since 2 years. And he has been working before a long time in IDRC, leading the strategic planning processes, the Inclusive Economies Program program, and especially where this webinar is about the think tank initiative. He will explain in detail what the think tank initiative was. Before he worked in Canada, he was working earlier in IDS, and before working in Vietnam and in Reading and in Botswana. Yeah, without much further ado, I think, Peter, the word to you.
Thanks so much.
Oh, sorry, Peter, just for order. We have a chat function and we have quite a lot of participants. So there are 2 ways that you could indicate that you want to comment something. During the presentation of Peter, please use the chat. After Peter's presentation, I will start a conversation, and then we can do a plenary conversation. We think more or less 20 minutes, where also you can raise hands to do it more presential, because our experience is that that creates a little bit better vibe in the webinar. That's all, Peter.
Great, thank you, Giel, and hello to everybody. It's really great that there's interest in this topic that we're going to talk about today. And as Giel mentioned, I'm kind of wearing 2 hats today. One is from an IDS perspective of being generally interested about these kinds of issues around evaluation of learning and organizational strengthening and institutional change and support. And also at the same time, going back to my previous time where I spent 11 years at IDRC. It's really nice to see some IDRC colleagues as well, from colleagues in the webinar. And during that time, as Giel said, I was involved quite for a number of years with this program called the Think Tank Initiative. And what I want to do today is to give a little bit of background about the Think Tank Initiative. Actually, there's really a lot to say about that, and it would take far more time than we have today to give all the background. So I'll do that quite briefly. And then mainly what I would like to do is to kind of draw on some of the ideas which are in the practice note, which has just been released, just published and available online. And that's really reflecting on some of the lessons learned and insights from a funder's perspective about commissioning and evaluation of a large complex program. So that's what I hope to do today. I've got a few slides which I'll share and talk through, and then it would be great to open up and have some conversation. So here, can I just check, is that showing? Has that moved on?
Yeah, fine.
Yeah, perfect. Okay. So the think tank initiative, very briefly, the purpose of it was to help strengthen independent policy research institutions in lower middle income countries. It was an interesting program because it was encapsulated 10 years of support, 2009 to 2019, and it combined two main dimensions. Core financial support, flexible financial support directly to institutions over a 10-year period, complemented by different kinds of capacity strengthening support. And I'll say a bit more about that. Again, even in budgetary terms, it was quite large, about 200 million Canadian dollars over 10 years. Began with around 52 institutions. In the program, they were referred to as grantees, so I'll just use that terminology just for consistency. And they were policy research institutions or think tanks that received this direct support, and eventually in 20 countries. And the three main areas of focus were on helping those institutions to move on a path towards sustainability in three core ways: around their organizational performance, around the quality of their research, and also around their policy engagements and communications. And you see on the map quite a significant coverage of geographical areas in Latin America, in Africa, West and East Africa, and also in South Asia. And also the other interesting part of it, which I'll talk a bit more about, was that it was a donor funding partnership of a number of agencies. The program was originally conceived by the Hewlett Foundation, and then IGRC joined with the Hewlett Foundation. IGRC is a co-funder and also as the implementer of the program. And then over time, there was also a partnership, donor partnership with the Gates Foundation, with DFID, as was with the Dutch Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and also NORAD in Norway. The think tanks themselves supported, worked across many different policy domains. So primarily it was economic and social sciences, but their work spoke to an array of areas and issues and challenges. You can see from this chart, as well as these sort of big macro and macroeconomic policy issues around governance, around education, environment and climate change, health, agriculture and food security, and very often working at the intersections between these. So, for example, looking at the intersections between environment and health or food security. And then why did this program sort of come about? What was the intent? Well, there are sort of three core principles, I guess, which drove it. One was the belief that as development challenges, however you define development, play out in a particular context, the solutions or ways of addressing those challenges are likely to be extremely useful when they're generated in that same context. So then the question arises of, what is the institutional base for generating evidence, for knowledge, which can help to address local challenges or challenges within particular contexts. And the photograph just is an example from Ghana, where a think tank in Ghana actually helped to provide evidence which related to the challenges associated with presidential transitions in the Ghanaian political system. And that led to the introduction of a law to facilitate transitions after presidential elections. The second point was really that inclusive policies and policy processes are likely to have a greater impact. So again, if you bring different actors, different stakeholders together, enable their views and their voices and their experience and knowledge to be heard, to be brought into the picture, for sense to be made out of that, that is likely to contribute to impact and change happening, whether it's in policy or practice. And again, many examples of how in different contexts, for example, in India, this was a case where evidence presented by an Indian think tank supported the government of India at the time to introduce regulations around affirmative action for employment in relation to Dalit people. And then the third purpose or reason for really having the think tank initiative was this notion that collaboration around evidence, around knowledge, around research helps build momentum, and it helps to catalyze influence. So collectivism, bringing together different voices, different experience, and that sort of manifested through the life of the think tank initiative with the emergence of a network which still exists today called Southern Voice, who to this day and even increasingly are getting real traction at the global level as well as regional and local national levels around generation of evidence and engagement around evidence for influencing policy and practice in different ways. Now, that's a think tank initiative, and there's a lot of information available. There's a website, which I can share the link of at the end, where you can find out a lot more. And obviously, when we get to questions, if anybody would like to ask anything specific, I'll try to respond. But now to move on to more onto the evaluation dimension of it. So this is a large complex program, as you can see, for a number of years, a large budget, multiple actors, different funders, different institutions involved. How would you go about an evaluation from the perspective of a funder that was trying to commission this? And so obviously, when you have many stakeholders, you're trying to find reasonable consensus about an evaluation approach. Why do you evaluate? What, with whom, and how? And so first of all, thinking about the institutions who were receiving support through the program, what was their view about it? Well, one thing to say is that think tanks vary enormously. It's a very eclectic community. Some of them were large, well-established organizations at the beginning. They had a big coverage of areas of work, and others were quite new, small startups, perhaps focusing on a particular issue within a very particular geography. And so they were different. It was a very heterogeneous group. And amongst that group, they had very different views about the value of evaluation, more or less interest. Some were particularly interested in it because they actually were undertaking evaluation themselves and were very interested in evaluation processes. They were also very interested about understanding more about how they were progressing and what was the impact of their work. And for others, there were other kinds of concerns, which might be, for example, well, if they were assessed in an evaluation for their performance, that could undermine their credibility and reputation, and ultimately it could affect their funding and survival. So that generated a lot of different views and perspectives about the evaluation approach from amongst the think tanks themselves. And then amongst the funders, equally, there were different views as well. I think you saw on the earlier slide that this was a funding partnership that involved a number of different funders, and new funders joined the partnership over time. And as each new funder came in, they brought different priorities and perspectives. They also had different views about what success looked like. They also had different ideas about what an evaluation could look like and when that should be. So for some, the idea was that, well, you'd have an evaluation at the end of the program, and then that could kind of look back and give an objective view of whether the program had been successful. Some were more interested in a more learning-oriented evaluation, which could accompany the program as it went and provide insights in real time. Some were interested in how individual think tanks had progressed from when they started receiving the support to where they got to by the end of 10 years of support. But I think it would be true to say all were interested in generalizable lessons learned, because they also, I think there was general agreement that in these many different national contexts, there were so many different forces at play that each think tank would need to work in ways which were appropriate to a context. So you couldn't generalize about look across all think tanks and compare them with each other, but you could try to learn lessons about what was happening, why in particular context, which would then help to inform wider understandings of how think tanks were actually working and how they could be supported. At the same time, the program did quite a lot of work around promoting evaluative thinking. And this was something that we just felt collectively was important, not just to think about, well, we need to have an evaluation because this is a big program and we should have an evaluation. We also felt that evaluative thinking for think tanks was really important. And that was a means of enabling the think tanks themselves to reflect on the progress that they were making, to think about whether the way they were investing their time, energy, making their commitments to certain areas of research were bringing about the results that they wanted to see themselves, and also to see how they were perceived by others. So we had, as is inevitable in large programs, quite a lot of monitoring data being collected from the think tanks themselves about progress that we were making. Then we had lots of learning events where we talked about the value of evaluative thinking for their work and how to embed that within their organizations. Within the think tank initiative itself, we were also very keen to take this as an opportunity to learn about evaluative thinking. And so we had quite a number of commissioned pieces of work for looking at, for example, trying to understand more about evidence into impact, evidence into policy, trying to understand how think tanks themselves saw the impact of their work, and also engaging with policy actors about their perceptions of value and the use of evidence, including evidence produced by think tanks. And in all of this, we tried to create really functioning feedback loops and mutual learning opportunities between the program, particularly the program officers who worked very closely with think tanks, and amongst the think tanks themselves. So this was really an effort to use evaluation as a promoter and a source of learning. Now, why evaluate the program? Well, over time, the reasons and the purpose for this changed. Initially, there was a lot of interest in generating lessons for the program itself, and for others who might be interested in supporting think tanks, to provide evidence which would help funders about whether or not this approach worked, to what extent it worked, and whether or not they might also think about providing this kind of support. Also, it was a means of helping to raise the profile of the program to promote the possibility of further support, and particularly to try to understand more about the impact that think tanks in general had on policies and practice, and whether the support from the program helped them to have that impact on policies and practice in their specific context. But there was very strong agreement that it would not try to assess the individual performance of specific think tanks. It would not try to compare think tanks with each other, because each had different starting points and were on different trajectories, and also not to try to contribute to which the program had contributed to an improvement in people's lives in wider society, because although that was present in the results framework, an evaluation to try to understand that really was deemed to be extremely challenging to carry out. Now, as the evaluation proceeded, there were some challenges arose. One of the ones that came through very strongly was the fact that when the program had been conceived originally, there wasn't an explicit theory of change. And so without that, the design and the implementation of the program was quite robust, but it wasn't based on that notion of, well, what kinds of outcomes and what kind of pathway towards outcomes and impact were we understanding underpinned the program, and how did we understand the way in which change might take place? What were our assumptions about that? And so without that, it also made it challenging to support an evaluation design, because without that theory of change, there wasn't that sort of basis to connect an evaluation design to an existing theory of change. There was a results framework, which was important, and that provided the basis for the funding partnership. And what was certainly good was that as new funders joined, they agreed fundamentally to accept the existing results framework. Sometimes they brought additional requests for additional information. For example, some funders needed a log frame, and that was done additionally, but they still bought in collectively to the idea of a shared results framework. But there were differences in their visions about the outcomes that would come from the program. And that, again, was an interesting challenge then for designing an evaluation. So you got these different views amongst the key stakeholders about what success should look like. And that then made it quite challenging initially to shape an evaluation. So as time went on, fortunately, I would say a good outcome for the program was that we did see emerging clarity around the evaluation approach. In the final half of the program, the last 5 years, we had a company called Neras who were selected to carry out the external evaluation, and we used an accompaniment model. So the idea was that they would actually work with the program independently at a distance, providing mechanisms using a robust methodology to understand what changes were taking place in the program, what was working for whom in specific contexts and why, and for us to be able to use that knowledge in real time to help inform and shape the program as it evolved, and also to be able then to give a view at the end of the program about what they saw had been learned from the program overall, based on this understanding of what worked in particular contexts and why. A core element of it was the use of stories of change. And that was something which had been put in place by an earlier round of the evaluation. And that proved really interesting about understanding the experience of different think tanks going through change processes, and what they were learning from that and what we could learn from that as well. I would say the evaluation as time went on really embraced complexity, and it moved away from performance assessment. The design pathway put individual think tanks within their own policy and political contexts, and the actual approach was based on a sample of 13 organizations out of the almost 50 by the end of the program, in order to do a deep dive to understand what worked and why in that particular context, but then to help to make more general inferences for the think tank initiative community overall. And in addition to engaging deeply with those 13 organizations, the evaluators also engaged regularly with institutions across the program. And then just to show you a visual of what the evaluators themselves constructed as their contribution analysis framework. So they used a realist evaluation approach, which was really emphasizing what was working for whom in a particular context and why. And you can see right in the middle here, there's a box with a dotted line around it, and you'll see some squiggly lines. I think this was a really relevant piece of the whole sense of the evaluation. If you imagine each of those lines is a think tank, then the progress that the think tank makes over a 5-year period or a 10-year period is going to be very circuitous. It's going to, sometimes it's going to have ups and downs, it's going to go in different directions, and that is influenced by multiple factors. You can see the boxes on the top and the bottom, by the labor market, by political openness, by networking possibilities, by what other funding is available outside in to these organizations, in addition to the funding that the think tank initiative gave, to emerging and changing policy agendas, and also to different forms of international and regional influence. And all of those factors, drivers, influenced the individual pathways of change by each think tank. So on the left, you can see that the main contributions from the program were core flexible funding over time, support to capacity development, capacity strengthening, and also networking support and convening. And then out of that, the big questions were, well, what did that progress look like for each of those think tanks in terms of organizational development, for the quality of their research, and for their ability to influence policy? And ultimately, what did we learn about the way in which research could inform and influence policy debate through the work of these institutions? So that was the framework that guided the final 4 years of the evaluation. A few lessons learned. Certainly a lot of findings about the think tank initiative approach that validated key premises of the theory of change, because the theory of change, having been absent or not well articulated early on, was put in place when the second phase was halfway through point of the program. And that had been really informed by an earlier group of evaluators who very helpfully interviewed all the funders, funding partners, and gathered insights and understandings from them about what their understanding of success looked like, and also working with the think tanks and other actors. And together that helped to elaborate a theory of change, which then guided the program going forward. The actual evaluation itself was very dialogical. The evaluators spent a lot of time engaging directly with the think tanks, especially the 13 who offered to be part of this process to give that deep dive, but also with others as well. And through that engagement, that actually created an enabling space for think tanks themselves to put strategies into action. I'll give you a couple of examples in just a moment. In terms of performance, it's quite interesting. Think tanks, policy, and other societal actors and funders had different views about what performance looks like in terms of a think tank. In some cases, it's can you generate research under extremely challenging political conditions when civil society is being constrained and there's not much openness to evidence. At other times, you have a lot of openness to evidence, and the political or policy environment is very welcoming to the use and the engagement with evidence. Then that constitutes a different kind of performance is needed. And so a level of understanding was really important around what performance meant, and that required time and required commitment. And then on the policy side, I think it's just also important to say that policy actor prior perceptions of the value of evidence and data is strongly influenced by their engagement with it and with its producers. So relevance was a word that came through very strongly If the evidence being generated is useful and is relevant and is perceived by policy actors as actually being something that is the right kind of evidence for their purposes at the right time, that can be readily usable, they know where to find it, they know how to access it, and when they do access it, they find it useful. That builds up an appreciation of the value of evidence as being useful. And I think that was something that, especially where think tanks developed effective relationships with different societal actors, including policymakers, that enabled them to really show that evidence was being increasingly valued and used. Just a few examples of actionable insights. So, for example, a think tank in El Salvador, they had been working for some time very closely with government, and of course governments change. So when the government changes, relationships would change, and the demand changes, and your ability to perhaps influence public debate changes. So they thought a lot about, well, how do we work with that, given that this keeps changing? And they discovered through this engagement, the feedback through the evaluation and the reflective conversations, that they could work more indirectly. So rather than always going directly to government, they work more on influencing a broader public debate, which could then sometimes succeed in generating political demand to which a government had to respond. So that might be through the media, it might be through civil society, it might be through other societal actors. And that was what they learned about how to reach decision makers who are hostile and don't listen to you. In another case, think tanks, a lot of the think tanks actually describe themselves as think and do tanks, because we're not only generating knowledge, but they were also very actively engaged in dialogues, in activities with different actors in society. And this was an example from Senegal, a think tank called CRESS, which really worked hard to increase its visibility, its network, and collaborating with different partners, including local government. And through that, and again engaging with the evaluation process, they got feedback and could reflect on their ability to demonstrate the impact that was based on their research through that change in their visibility and their different forms of collaboration. Those are just a few examples. There are many others which came through the conversations. For example, think tanks being politically aware, but not partisan. Learning more about peer learning and mentoring. Learning more about the importance of organizational reflection and learning, and also really putting communication at the heart of policy engagement. And just coincidentally, just to illustrate, this is still going on. The program actually finished now over 3 years ago, but just today I received this invitation from an Indian think tank called CSTEP, who work particularly on science and technology. And you can see this is happening on the 11th of October, connecting the dots, learn the nuances of engaging with the media and why it is essential for the research community to do so. So there's an example that shows that not only was it this realization that policy engagement and communication was important simply because it was a feature of the program. This is something that's actually become embedded within the life and work of the think tanks, and they're still carrying on doing it. So you can see they're having that webinar the 11th of October if you want to join. Very quickly, lessons learned. Well, I think what we did learn was that from the evaluation that confirmed some key indicators of a high-performing think tank. However you might come to that notion of high performance, what was really crucial was the quality of the research combined with policy engagement and communications, not surprisingly, the presence of strong and effective leadership, a combination of an organizational strategy and a plan that was built on a sound business model. Very importantly, the ability to attract and to retain high caliber of staff. And then finally, something which perhaps might feel almost like a luxury, but actually is probably one of the most enabling dimensions of an effective organization, is the employment conditions. For any organization, what's the stability? Is the income going to be guaranteed or secured? Is it inclusive? Is it safe? Is it an enabling workplace which is amenable for its employees? And we saw that the support overall from the think tank initiative really did help these organizations really work on these different dimensions. And we saw they moved in different ways, and the evaluation very interestingly grouped them into 4 categories. One group they actually referred to as transformational, where the trajectory that they've been on really managed to demonstrate in all of those areas that they made a large leap forward, that they significantly transform the nature of their organization. In other cases, they were already doing a number of these things, but the support from the program helped them to accelerate that and to catalyze it and to be able to make more of it, not necessarily transforming how they were, but moving things forward at a pace. A third group, the evaluators, felt that the support had enabled them to consolidate things that they were doing, and they knew where they still wanted to go, but at that particular moment, they had managed to bring things together and were working well, and that what was important for them was to keep going. And then the fourth category, because in some of the contexts, the national context, those challenges that you saw in that diagram earlier on around the external environment were so complicated and so dynamic that actually keeping afloat was an achievement in itself. And in some very difficult national contexts, particularly sometimes for political reasons, just actually surviving was an enormous achievement, and that was something which the support enabled to do. Finally, just a few quick reflections about the evaluation overall. I think one thing that's important to say is that the program itself was about change. It was about supporting incremental organizational change of think tanks through an emergent process. So if that's the nature of your program, then it feels logical, and I think that what was borne out through experience, that the evaluation approaches also need to be incremental and iterative. A theory of change is really valuable. It helps stakeholders define the purpose of the evaluation, and it also helps a shared understanding and expectations of what impact and success looks like. Learning is really important. Programmatic learning, a large program like the Think Tank Initiative, it was hugely important, and we use monitoring evaluation to support that, but it requires investment, it requires intentional facilitation, it requires good design, and it requires really good dialogue, listening to different parties. It's not a top-down exercise that you just design and roll out. Over a 10-year program, the objectives of the program may evolve, and then sometimes the objectives of the evaluation, therefore, may also need to change, and that's part of that learning and adaptation. The Think Tank Initiative was a large, complex program. It therefore benefited from an evaluation that was aware of complexity and put that at the center of how it worked, because otherwise many outcomes emerged which otherwise would have been missed if you just used a log frame, for example, where you were looking at specific indicators and targets. You would have captured those which were identified at the beginning if your monitoring system was working reasonably well, but you would just miss potentially a whole series of outcomes otherwise that were generated. And then finally, actually the methodology of using stories of change and impact were not only useful for evaluation, for learning, they also became really important communication tools for the Think Tank Initiative as well. And I think that was an important lesson, that evaluation, it needs to be useful for as many actors as possible. It had value for the funders, it had value for the program, but it also had value for the think tanks themselves, who were able to use some of its outputs for their own purposes to actually continue their journey towards sustainability. I shall stop there. Giel, thank you very much indeed, and back to you. I'll stop sharing. Oh, you're muted, Giel. Giel, you are muted.
There's always an issue still after so many years of using Zoom. I will start with some questions, but I would ask people to already prepare some questions, because the idea is that we give you the floor after I did 2 questions. And one question is based, I had the luxury of reading the practice paper before it was open in the open space, what it is now. And it's clear that there was a gradual change in the approach to evaluating it. You already explained it also in this webinar. And you ended up with the what works for whom under what conditions questions, the realist evaluation questions. And it's something which in our CDI seminars comes up very, very common. It's becoming some sort of considered by many people as the more useful evaluation question for almost everybody, even commissioners, but especially, of course, the people who are being evaluated, but also the ones that are evaluating. So why do you think that commissioners do not start with this question at the outset? It appears to be, even for them, a far more interesting and relevant question than asking whether the intervention works or not, or how much. But I note in your practice paper that you had some challenges at the start of convincing your donor constituency with that learning-oriented approach. Can you extend a little bit on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think, obviously what was good is that as time went on, I think we got to where we wanted to get to in terms of having this realist theory-based evaluation, which was really understanding, that for a complex intervention like institutional strengthening, which also produced mixed outcomes, that you needed an evaluation that could help understand how and why differential outcomes occur in different contexts, and where you've got lots of interactions, and also to generate this wider learning. So that was good. Earlier on, I think there were some factors that were, initially made these conversations a bit more challenging. And part of that was because I think getting agreements amongst the funding partners that an accompaniment model would provide a credible, robust evaluation approach was really the way to go. And part of the reason for that was the sense that, well, might this entail the evaluators losing their objectivity on, not coming up with a sort of a credible evaluation? And this was a little bit informed to some extent by evaluation thinking around that time, because the think tank initiative started in the late 2000s. This was the time that Michael Quinn Patton was doing work on developmental evaluation. That was just getting recognized as an approach that was seen as useful. And even theories of change methodology were only just becoming mainstreamed. So these ideas around real-time learning and accompaniment approaches were at an early stage of evolution, I would say. And now they're much more well established. It's unusual now not to find a theory of change just for almost every program. But when, in the mid-2000s, when the think tank initiative was being conceived, theories of change was still, actually as a methodology, was at an early stage of development. So I think these were factors that played into, I wouldn't say it was a resistance, but perhaps a lack of familiarity about the possibilities that more learning-oriented approaches could bring. And then another part of it, which was actually a little bit challenging, was finding evaluators who really were, I would say, sufficiently familiar with using these kinds of learning-oriented approaches with a large, complex program. And again, just as evaluation thinking was changing and evolving, evaluation practice was changing and evolving. So again, by the time we rebooted and did this exercise again in halfway through the program, by that time, evaluation thinking and practice had actually moved along quite significantly. And there were evaluators out there who, when we had a call to invite proposals to do this, we had a number of really good proposals from different organizations. We selected one group to work with. But 5 years into the program, the sort of the evaluation environment itself had changed. Another thing that was also really helpful was that at the end of the first 5 years of the evaluation, we had a really good evaluation team from ECDPM in the Netherlands, and they essentially came in and said, well, we don't see a clear theory of change in the way that the program is articulated, and therefore what we want to do is to try to use this evaluation, a midpoint evaluation, to develop a theory of change that has broad consensus amongst the different stakeholders. So that was a really important contribution they made. They also made another really important contribution by using a stories of change methodology. And essentially, they spent time with different think tanks thinking about the context in which they were working, the political economy which was driving their research and use of evidence in their country. And they identified a story of change, or which showed how the work of that think tank had contributed to some form of change in policy and practice. And they came up with really a fantastic array of these. And that methodology, I think, fed into the notion that, well, you could actually develop these even more interestingly and effectively over a more extended period. So by the time we came into the second phase of the program, the last 5 years, there was a greater appreciation of what this kind of learning-oriented approach could offer. There were people, evaluators there who could offer it, and there were methodologies to hand, which they were able to draw on, and in some cases to innovate, which they were able to bring, which I think helped to bring the funders on board to realize, yes, this would be a good approach to use. Oh, you're muted again, Phil.
There one other question before I give the floor. You in your talk, you say that engagement with policy actors is a key issue for think tanks. Obviously, it's also for an evaluation. What has been the involvement or the relation between NERAS as a sort of an external company and the stakeholders, especially the policymakers or the people who have funded or commissioned or supported IDRC in the whole evaluation process? How did you involve them in the discussions? Can you give an idea about that process?
Yeah, I think that was an interesting part of the process, because one thing is fair to say for anyone who's thinking about this kind of approach, it's quite time and energy consuming. So there's a big commitment of effort that's needed, you know, for a program which is implementing something like the think tank initiative. People are very busy. There's a lot of activities going on, and so you want to try to build in that time to have really good, serious conversations around evaluation. And so making time and space for that engagement is sometimes difficult to do, but it's really important. In terms of quite practical governance of the evaluation, the think tank initiative had what we call an executive committee, and that comprised representatives of the donor partnership, as well as from IDRC as a co-funder and the implementer. And they worked really closely, and I must say really effectively, in engaging with the evaluators. So as the evaluators were you know, generating the initial approach, they did an inception report, for example, and we had that discussion with them. There was a lot of feedback. There wasn't agreement about everything by any means. So they, you know, took that back, they worked with it. And, you know, one of the interesting things, of course, is that you're navigating that interesting territory about offering sort of strategic ideas and guidance about what would be felt would be useful for the evaluation, without trying to interfere with the evaluation itself, which can then compromise the integrity of the evaluation. So we had quite a lot of discussion about that, and we had to navigate that quite carefully. And we had colleagues within the team who did a lot of liaison with the evaluators, with the funders, just to manage that relationship so that it was really constructive, but you know, credible, to maintain that credibility and rigor of the evaluation. And certainly, you know, we received actual annual reports from the evaluators, who gave us, there were interim reports so that we could see and discuss what they were finding. What was really interesting was, because it was real time and the engagement was quite productive, quite often when they brought recommendations about how the program perhaps should consider possible adaptations, some of those were already happening, because through the dialogue, it actually generated the realization that there were certain things needed to happen to strengthen the program. So by the time they brought their interim report, some of the things had already been addressed, which was fine, because it didn't mean we got to the end point and said, oh, I wish we'd done that 5 years ago. You know, we actually could look back and say, yeah, we're doing it, and this is really helpful. And by the end of the program, I think they had also done a really good level of engagement with policy actors, with think tanks, with other stakeholders in national context, especially where those 13 cases were that they included. And they had very good engagement and feedback sessions with the think tanks themselves, sharing the information back, as well, obviously, with the funders. So it was a long, protracted process. It involved a lot of commitment to time and energy, and to some extent cost. But overall, the value of the learning through it, I think, was extremely high and led to some really productive outcomes.
Great. Hey, I wanted to ask Isaac Bird, if you could unmute yourself and show yourself to ask your question. Is that possible?
Yes, yes, I'm in a location where I can't speak very loudly right now, so I'll be brief. I'm in the Sussex Library, but yeah, I was really especially interested on the, you mentioned that there were organizations that were very diverse in scope, size, capacity, etc. And that particularly that there were some organizations, think tanks that you were working with who had some reservations about evaluation methodology and kind of the implications of engaging in an evaluation such as the one that was conducted. So I'd just like to hear a little bit more about, I guess, the strategies or approaches that you leveraged to kind of ease some of those concerns and ultimately build consensus on the ultimate methodology, theory of change, et cetera, that were leveraged, recognizing that there was so much diversity of opinion and perspective. Thank you.
Yeah, shall I respond to that one straight off, or do you want to gather a few?
No, I think please respond.
Yeah, no, thanks, Isaac. Nice to know you're in Sussex Library, just down the road. It's a really good question. So, right from the start, we had conversations about evaluation, the purpose of evaluation, what would we try to understand, what was happening through it, why, how would that be useful and valuable? And I must say that, so we started off originally with 52 think tanks supported through the Think Tank Initiative, and not all were really, to be honest, interested about the program itself. I mean, really, the reality for many think tanks is a very tough existence. They're often working in quite hostile, turbulent, dynamic political environments. They're often resource poor. They're trying to find the right cadre of staff to recruit and to retain. They're trying to ensure that the work they do actually gets out into the public domain in useful ways. So for some, their interest wasn't so much about how the program was going to evaluate the program. For them, for their perspective as well, yeah, just get on with it. We'll help if we can, but we don't have a particular view. For some, they were in very particular challenging contexts where if they perceived that the evaluation would make a judgment on them as an institution, some were concerned that could undermine their credibility. Obviously, if the judgment was identifying and making publicly available some aspects of their work or their performance that they felt could be perceived as negative. So that could undermine perception of them by policy actors, about whether they felt their evidence was useful and whether they accessed it. It could have an influence on their partners, societal partners, civil society, media relations, and it could also have an impact on funders, because I must say it's quite common for funders to say, "Oh, have you worked with organization A or B? And what are they like?" And so you have to be very careful then, because you don't want to provide information which is going to jeopardize the relationship that an organization in a challenging context has with others, unless there's something really specific that you feel in the public domain that needs to be raised. And it did happen, unfortunately, that some of the think tanks that were supported at the beginning of the Think Tank Initiative didn't make it through into the second phase. And there are different reasons for that. And sometimes it was because they faced incredibly difficult political challenges, very constraining environments, or it could just be that other sources of funding that they'd been dependent on just dried up. So we agreed with them that we didn't want to use the evaluation to make public statements about individual think tanks and their performance. What we were interested in learning about was the journey that they were on from where they began and where they moved to, and what would be helpful for them to learn about that in terms of things which would help them do their work better within the context and to manage some of the challenges which they faced. I would just also say that when we had these conversations and brought think tanks together, very often, again, it's that sort of actionable insights point. They started talking with each other, of course, and started to, they started to actually exchange ideas and experiences about how to deal with certain problems they were facing. Sometimes the context was different, but perhaps the issue wasn't terribly different. How do you recruit staff? How do you engage with how do you engage with policy actors around a difficult politically sensitive issue? How do you engage with the media in ways that you basically just won't get taken advantage of? So when people came together talking about evaluation in general, they also talked about things that they could learn from each other and exchange ideas and experience. So in the end, I think we got to a point where we felt there was a good consensus across the community, but a lot of that was based on trust and mutual respect and time. And I think one of the things that came through particularly, and I know one of the former program officers for the program is on the webinar right now, one of the key evaluation lessons was that the relationship between the IGRC program officers and the think tanks was a really important piece of the trust building dimension of the program, so that when you had more challenging questions about things like evaluation, there was that mutual respect and trust in place, so that you could have more frank, open and constructive and honest conversations about how people felt about things.
Hey Peter, there are two persons who wanted to raise issues about the challenges you encounter, because you depict it as quite a successful and there must be some sort of conflict in the evaluation of each of the think tanks. There must be different perspectives. Marina, perhaps you can unmute. You had a direct question under the name of Gilton, but now you're Marina again.
Hi everyone, I'm Marina, not Hill. Always trying to be like Hill. Thanks, Peter. No, that was it's a really inspiring story actually. So it's wonderful to be hearing more about it. And yeah, I mean, you've discussed a lot. You've talked about how you managed to bring those different perspectives together. I guess the question is, was there any real conflict there? Because in my experience, it's thinking about evaluation not just as this technical methodological endeavor, but essentially as a political decision-making endeavor, which is what you've laid out really nicely, often does involve conflict. So was that there, and how did you navigate that? And if I could just take the opportunity to ask another quick question, if that's all right, Gil, which is this idea of the stories of change and impact. In the paper, you actually discuss some of the tensions around them being on this continuum, right? And how on the one hand, they can be sort of nice stories about impact and what we achieve, which we like for comms. And on the other hand, they could be really rigorous evidencing of contribution claims. And then in your talk, you sort of suggested both of those can come together neatly. But again, is that the case? Are there not trade-offs? Did that come up at all?
Yeah, thanks. You're digging into the underbelly of the story, and this is exactly what we want to do. Yes, I mean, so of course there were conflicts in the sense of disagreements and different views at different points along the journey amongst different actors. So certainly when, going back to the last question, when we began broaching the question about an evaluation with the think tanks themselves, this concern about them, potentially being highlighted or identified as performing or not performing in certain ways was a real concern, and some of that, was expressed in no uncertain terms. And we had to really work through, what were the fears, what were we trying to do and to learn through the evaluation, and how could we make sure that it was a valuable learning opportunity but didn't expose them to that. So that wasn't just them sort of saying, oh, we're a bit worried about this. Some were really deeply concerned, and there were some heated moments along there. Early on in the process, amongst the funders themselves, there were differences in views as well. Some of them quite strong about, I mentioned what the success looked like. So, for example, for some funders, they saw success being that the support enabled think tanks to move on the journey towards sustainability. So if they were already well advanced on that journey, that wouldn't look like an enormous change. It would really be about enabling them to secure what they'd already managed to put in place and to continue doing that really well. Whilst for others, it was a much bigger journey. They were recently formed, perhaps a small staff. They had quite big ambitions, and they wanted to sort of move along this journey. And then for them, that might be quite quite a transformational change or accelerating things that they already wanted to do. So for some funders, that understanding of the trajectory was well taken. For some, there was a vision that, you know, there was a certain kind of organizational form that should be the object of the think tank initiative. So, you know, if you imagine, for example, a think tank in the UK or in North America, you know, some funders thought, well, at the end of 10 years, you should have 50 organizations who all look like that. And that wasn't really what, you know, that was I would say not really a possible task or even a desirable task, because in the end, all these organizations should go on their own journeys and get to where they need to go with the right kind of support. You know, identifying who would undertake the evaluation and what kinds of skills you would need. And, you know, as I mentioned, this gradual process of moving from a more kind of classic end of program, was it successful or not, towards something which is more learning oriented. A lot of discussion took place around that too. But the good part of it was that by the end of the first phase, after 5 years of the program, I think because of the hard discussions that have taken place, and some of them, if you'd been listening in, you might have used the word conflict. By going through those, the relationship built up became really strong, and a degree of trust was established that allowed for disagreement, but for mutual respect still to stay in place. And that was really important, and that really, I think, served very well over the remaining 5 years. And again, you know, even the conversations with the evaluation team about the approach, there were different views about that, and lots of, you know, quite intense discussions. But I think by the end, we all got to where we felt we wanted to get. On your point about those stories of change, yes, I think there are trade-offs sometimes. I mean, some of them were very amenable to becoming good communication tools. I mean, the think tanks themselves thought this is a great story. Now we see it presented in a certain way. We can use that, and they used it sometimes for fundraising purposes, for demonstrating in a proposal that this, you know, to another funder, this is something we've done. It worked really well. This is actually like a kind of impact stories that we also generated at IDS. In other cases, they weren't all amenable for that kind of communication purpose. Sometimes they were about a more technical dimension of a policy or practice change, or thinking about a certain kind of evidence. So yeah, there were trade-offs there. They weren't all as amenable for communication tools as others. But we did encourage every think tank, at least by the end of the program, to have identified one impact story that they could use as a communication tool, because that is just a really valuable piece of resource mobilization strategies to be able to sort of have that to support and demonstrate how you can do your work.
Peter, I want to ask the last question. We're 2 o'clock now, but just to have a question, because the word think tank, especially in the UK, is in the newspapers now, because think tanks are very much politically motivated. So there are think tanks supporting the new government in the UK, and there are think tanks that are more left-winging. And of course, that's the same in developing countries. So how did you navigate that as a think tank initiative? Of course, you support one actor in the country, and you could make it a monopolist a little bit because they are supported by the think tank initiative. How do you manage those political issues?
Yeah, I mean, there were concerns about, you know, crowding in and crowding out different actors. I mean, it was interesting when the program first started. Some funders said, well, why are you not supporting universities, for example, and think tanks? And well, the view was there were quite a lot of programs supporting universities already, and this think tank group was a rather neglected group often by funders because they were kind of emerging in many contexts. There are definitely some think tanks which are ideologically and politically aligned, and we made it very clear in the selection of the original selection of those that would receive support that we would not support a think tank which, you know, really was clearly, explicitly aligned to a particular political set of views. So that was something that was kind of really an intent through the selection process. One of the ways that, you know, you can often see that is the degree of transparency that think tanks or policy research institutes have about their funding. So, you know, if you go on any think tank website and you look under our funding partners, it's really interesting to see who appears there. In fact, does any information appear there? So that was something we thought, transparency around that is really important. I mean, for IDS where we are, that's also important. You know, we need to say, where does the support we receive to do the work we do come from? Because anybody looking at that should be able to kind of at least hold us to account, you know, not to be aligned with specific kind of political orientation. So that was perhaps one thing to say. The other thing was, in a number of countries, we supported several think tanks. So in certain countries in East Africa, for example, we supported 3, or in one case even 4. I think in Nigeria, we began by starting 4 think tanks. So we weren't sort of trying to monopolize support to one institution to allow that to almost, you know, grab the field. We realized in larger countries, support to a number of institutions would be important. I would also say Andrew's point there, which he's raised, I know he's just about to go, is that I think what I'm really quite excited about is this week I've had 2 conversations with other funders who are thinking about this model of supporting think tanks in Africa in the future. And I think that's great, because it does demonstrate that although they won't necessarily replicate the think tank initiative model, I know they're aware of it, they're keen to learn from it. I know that they've been looking at the evaluation, and we've had conversations, you know, sharing learning about it, and they will develop their own approach about how they want to offer this kind of support. But I think this idea of offering this longer term flexible financial support is hugely important for institutions that otherwise are constantly on a day-to-day basis just grappling to try to find money. So that's just a response to Andrew's question. I can see he was just departing as well.
Great. Hey, time-wise, I know that people have very strict schedules nowadays with those Zoom meetings. So feel free to jump out. Just before you jump out, I just want to make an advertisement that next week we also have an event. It's about ethics and evaluation. It will be chaired by Marina Apkar, and you're invited to that seminar too. I hope that people have some minutes, so I give the floor to somebody who really wants to ask a question still, or I know that there are some people from IDRC in the call, as Peter said, so perhaps someone can give a bit of reflection from their point of view also. Or who do you want to invite, Peter, from the participant list too?
Well, no, well, I'm just looking to see. I saw there were a couple of questions. There was one from Kevin, which I could just, I'm not sure if he's still on the call. I think he might have gone off, but he had asked, how did the concept of complexity aware evaluation manifest in your plan, and how did this differ from a conventional approach? I think really what emerged very quickly was that understanding the political economy of any national context was going to be really important in both framing and undertaking the evaluation. So I think the evaluators did a really good job of not only sort of looking at the the kind of different ways in which the think tanks themselves are working, but about how evidence and research was perceived, valued, and used in different national contexts by different kinds of policy actors. That was coupled, I think, also with the policy community surveys, which we undertook, which I think were also really interesting, sets of findings about policy actors' perceptions about the value of evidence. So I think this is how by coming at it from different ways, even though the program itself was oriented to supporting think tanks, so you could describe that as the suppliers of evidence. There was a lot of engagement in the broader environment with other societal actors to try to understand their perceptions of the use and value of evidence, and also their awareness of the work that the think tanks themselves were doing. And that was quite interesting, because in some cases, some think tanks, became very well known in the public space, and for others, policy actors would say, "Well, who is this? Who are you talking about?" Then it was clear that perhaps that awareness hadn't been achieved so much for different reasons. Another thing that changed during the life of the program was the emergence of social media. I mean, when the program began in 2009, actually social media was not being very widely used, and over that 10 years, its use has just become absolutely colossal, and its influence is colossal. So I think many of the think tanks who became very effective at engagement with different societal actors use social media, are using social media to very, very good effect, and engaging with the media as well as that publicity I put up from the think tank in India about helping others to think how to do that. It's good too that think tanks are sharing their experiences about how they've done this as well, which can help others to learn more about it.
Brilliant, Peter. I think it's clear that there is more food for webinars in the think tank initiative, and each think tank is of course a wealth of experiences in each of those countries. Thank you for this webinar. I think it was really nice to have that commissioner perspective on evaluation, because in previous webinars we focus a little bit too much perhaps on methods, and of course they are very much constrained by what commissioners allow evaluators to do, and also they are, you can do a lot of nice things, but if policymakers aren't engaged or commissioners aren't engaged in the process, obviously the result is also not optimal often, and sometimes quite frustrating. So these type of challenges are exactly where CDI, Center for Development Impact, is a community of practice about. So I thank everybody who is still online. There's still 17. We were 41 or so, 45 participants in this webinar. So I think it was a success. Thank you, Peter.
Thank you. And I'll just put the link as well to the, let's see if I can put it in the chat, the link to the Think Tank Initiative website, because actually, and it's also mentioned in the paper, but there's a huge body of resources there, which, if you're interested in, not only all the evaluation reports are on there, but also, some of the tools and the approaches that the program used to promote evaluative thinking. Some of the work which was undertaken by the think tanks themselves is also there. So there's a great resource, which luckily still remains. IDRC has committed to keeping it live, so it doesn't disappear. And I'll just encourage anyone to take a look at it as well. But thanks, Giel, and thanks to everyone, those who asked questions and everybody who participated. It's been a lot of fun doing this today. Thank you.
Okay, bye.